Hey, my name's Nathaniel Fawson. I'm an archaeologist, and this channel is dedicated to the archaeology of North America, in particular the region that we call the Eastern Woodlands. Now, today I want to talk about a research paper that came out in 2015 that I think does a good job of summarizing some important aspects of how caves and rock shelters and other cavernous spaces were used during the Archaic period. This is the paper here, and it's easy enough to find with a Google search. I'll also put a link to it down in the video description. I talk about caves and rock shelters a lot because my graduate work was on one. These are two different kinds of cavernous sites that hunter-gatherers used in the eastern woodlands with a lot of frequency. From the late Paleo-American period through to, contact modern day even. Sites like this have several important attributes. They're fixed locations on the landscape. They tend to be associated with water sources. They're cool in the summer and warm in the winter, relatively speaking. And they tend to be spiritually significant places for Native American peoples in their history and religion and philosophy and so on. And so, for instance, the Choctaw tradition, or at least one of the Choctaw traditions, is that they and their neighbors emerged from a cave. So these are complicated sites. There's a lot going on with them. Holmesy Messer is evaluating a few aspects of these sites. When did people use them? Was it permanent? Was it seasonal? Was it following some other kind of non-natural cycle? Who is using them? Is it the entire community? Is it mostly men or mostly women? Or maybe religious specialists? What were the people using the sites for? What kinds of activities were going on at these sheltered sites? And since this is archaeology, we also want to know about the diachronic question. How are these behaviors, the who's, the whens, the what's, how are these things changing over time? Specifically in the transition from the early Archaic to the Middle Archaic around 8,900 years ago. Archaeological features are going to play a strong role in this analysis. For those of you who aren't familiar, archaeologically, a feature is like an artifact in that it is something that people made, but it's not something that you can collect and put in a bag. The big examples are typically pit features and fireplaces, like hearth features, because you can take all of the fill out of these pits and put them in bags and send them off to labs and have them floated and all that. But they cease to be a pit once you do that. They are very non-permanent. The research that Holmesy Messer is doing focuses on these really intensively. She does a combination of morphometric analysis, so the sizes and shapes of these things, soil chemistry analysis, and what's called thin section lithography, which is basically where you take a brick of the soil still in its you can't scoop it out. You actually have to take it as a brick so that the particulate matter is still articulated with itself as it was in the ground. Then they impregnate that with a resin to harden it, cut that into thin slices, polish them so that light will pass through, and then put them on microscopic slides so that you can get pictures of the soil structure and compare them to other known samples so that you can say like how these soils were laid down and structured in the first place. These are all methodologies that have been used for a long time, but it's rare for soil chemistry and the thin section lithography to be applied to feature analysis, and that's really what makes Laura's work stand out. Just so I cover the bases, the other main type of feature is called a cluster feature, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a cluster of objects. So the Clovis caches that I talked about in the Solutrean hypothesis video, those are a kind of cluster feature. We can excavate those objects and have the objects, but their arrangement and orientation and placement on the landscape and so on have all been destroyed once we do that. It's part of the destructive nature of archaeology as a process. So Holmesy Messer is going to use 4 sites to evaluate these questions: Dust Cave, Stanfield Worley Bluff Shelter, and Russell Cave in Alabama, and the Modoc Rock Shelter in Illinois. All three of these have early and middle archaic components, so between about 10,000 and 6,000 years old. They're all situated in different ecological areas, so we're not seeing patterns that are unique to a particular environment. And data from these sites are within a amount of reason, well published and intercomparable. Russell Cave isn't as great as it could be, but hopefully that's going to change here in the next few years. You would not believe how difficult it is to find sites that have the kind of published data that you need to do inter-site comparisons. So in this case, what she needs is for each site to have published spatial data, like where all of the features are in place, thorough radiocarbon dates on them, lithic, faunal, and ethnobotanical analyses, and sufficient data on the morphologies, the sizes and measurements on the features, and she needs to have all of that at once in some capacity. And it's rare for a site to be given that amount of detail all the way through. So, starting with Dust Cave, it has 359 recorded features. 41 of these are mortuary in nature. 66 of them are hearths. 124 are charcoal pits. 15 ash pits. 30 charcoal concentrations. 17 rock-filled pits, and 34 ash or charcoal lenses. These were separated into 5 burned types and 3 unburned types. So these are the burned types. Prepared surfaces is number 1. I've talked about these before. These are thin layers of clay that have been flattened out on the floor of the cave and usually have a fabric or a basket impression so that they're slightly concave in the middle. They have charcoal and ash embedded in the top, and the author's analysis found that they contain medium and high chain fatty acids, which correspond to tubers, nuts, fish, or snails. These were most likely used to roast nuts and to steam fish. Surface hearths are generally just under 1 meter in diameter and have a basin shape. They usually have a rock lining and have a reddened perimeter from the intense heat. These are the roasting fires and central hearths found on the site. Pit hearths are about half as wide as surface hearths with similar depths, about 15 centimeters usually. These are found mostly on the east side of the cave and first appear at the end of the early Archaic period and become progressively more common throughout the Middle Archaic. These fires were heated to lower temperatures than the surface hearths, and they're full of nut charcoal. They were likely used to boil nuts for oil production. We'll talk about that more later. Expedient hearths are similar to pit hearths, except they're not as deep, but they're mostly from the Middle Archaic. They're burned at lower temperatures and contain a lot of fish bone. Rakeouts are a smear of burned material on the floor from clearing out a previously used hearth. The unburned features include human burials, dog burials, storage pits, and things of that nature. Burials are mostly associated with the Middle Archaic, although there are a few in the early Archaic, while storage pits are only dated to the end of the early Archaic. Candy Hollenbach's botanical analysis indicates that the cave was most intensively occupied in the late summer and early fall, and phosphorus concentrations in the soil are on the higher end, which correlates to intensive occupation, especially in the Middle Archaic. The layout of the cave is one in which major cooking features are concentrated in the center. Nut processing and minor cooking features were concentrated to the east, and refuse was discarded to the north. Over the course of the Middle Archaic, feature diversity decreased. Feature density, especially those associated with the processing of nuts, like hickory and acorn, increased, and nut cracking stones became more common in the artifact assemblage. People at Dust Cave were utilizing the space as a specialized nut processing facility in the fall when those resources were abundant. The Sandfield Worley shelter is a more upland shelter. It's part of a sandstone overhang. It's about 12 miles to the south of Dust Cave. And here we have about 108 features documented. There are, of course, more. The whole thing hasn't been excavated. These include 10 storage pits, 58 refuse concentrations, 18 surface hearths, and 6 prepared clay surfaces, as well as 11 burials. In contrast to Dust Cave, Stanfield Worley's feature diversity increased in the Middle Archaic. Storage pits became more commonplace. Similar to Dust Cave, people here first began to bury their dead in the shelter during the transition from the early to the Middle Archaic. The presence of burned nutshell in large quantities indicates that people occupied the shelter at least in the fall months. It was excavated in the 60s, so far less data on artifact density through time is available. But formal stone tool numbers do increase in the Middle Archaic, suggesting increased occupation. Again, the transition to the Middle Archaic comes with an increase in tools and features designed to process nuts. Excavations at Russell Cave in the 1960s produced a similar suite of features, although they aren't as well documented and published. It's hard to quantify these with any certainty, but based on some of Griffin's field notes and photography, Holmesy Messer's been able to piece together some of this. And the seasonal indicators, including the age at death for white-tailed deer, indicate that the people were occupying this space in the Middle Archaic in the late spring, or late fall rather, to the early winter. And the volume of cultural material, the artifacts, suggests there's a slight increase in activity at the site after the transition to the Middle Archaic period. Again, storage pits also appear here in the Middle Archaic period only. At Modoc Shelter in Illinois, we have a similar suite of features that were more precisely described than those at Russell Cave or Stanfield Worley. The large and shallow surface features are present, the surface hearths, as are the medium-sized boiling pits from the pit hearth category that was used to kind of organize Dust Cave. You also get small pits near the larger ones with ash and charcoal rakeout associated. And this is probably from hot rock boiling, where you have one pit, you fill it with water, you have another pit that you have fire in, you put rocks in the fire. As the rocks get hot, you put them in the water, it causes the boil, and you swap the rocks out regularly as they cool down and heat them back up. There are also larger storage pits at Modoc Shelter, which start to pop up in the Middle Archaic again. And there are also those prepared clay surfaces that we saw at Dust Cave. The early Archaic occupation was sporadic, and it becomes much more intense in the Middle Archaic, with seasonality proxies corresponding to summer, fall, and winter. So the early Archaic at Modoc was characterized by much more sporadic occupation, which increases in the Middle Archaic, where we have seasonal proxies indicating the summer, fall, and winter seasons of occupation. Hickory nutshell spiked to represent almost 80% of the plant assemblage during the Middle Archaic, and these hickory nuts are accompanied by the usual suite of nut processing features, like the prepared clay surfaces, the smaller pit hearths, and the storage pits. So Holmesy Messer is observing 4 trends at these sites in how the function of these shelters changed after the transition to the Middle Archaic, or slightly before in some cases. Each site was occupied primarily in the late summer and early fall. They are occupied with greater intensity by more people over the course of the Middle Archaic. Evidence for plant use spikes during this period, particularly in the form of tree-based nuts like hickory nuts, walnuts, and acorns, and the processing of these nuts in the form of roasting to kill parasites before storage and boiling to produce oils. It becomes much more apparent and much more intensive in the Middle Archaic. Holmesy Messer is interpreting this to mean that in the Middle Archaic period, people were using these shelter sites specifically for the bulk production of these tree mast based products. It's for the production of them and the storage of them. They're calorie rich and they have a lot of different applications outside of just food. This contrasts with some of the more old fashioned interpretations of this change in settlement patterning that John Walthal's work describes as long-term generalized base camps. Holmes and Messer is arguing the opposite. These are really short-term, high-intensity bursts of activity that are happening in the fall and the late summer. Also, the logistical reorganization of these kinds of sites seems to have started a little bit earlier than was previously thought. It's actually starting at the end of the early Archaic rather than at the very beginning of the Middle Archaic. Modoc was a little different in some of these respects. It actually does seem to be more of a generally used habitation site. Holmes and Messer writes, quote,
at Modoc, high diversity in the lithic, faunal, botanical, and feature assemblages, coupled with structures, multi-season occupation, and extensive storage pits, indicate that the Middle Archaic occupation was a multi-season base camp. Yet the preponderance of prepared clay surfaces, pit hearths, and the sheer quantity of nutting stones and carbonized nutshell suggest that bulk processing of mast was a prominent activity. This is not surprising given Modoc's ecotone setting that would have been ideally situated to collect nuts in both lowland and upland regions without the need to establish numerous satellite camps farther abroad. Ecotone sites like Modoc then highlight important variation in cave and rock shelter use along a continuum of functions.
I just want to stop here and point out that this can seem like a really trivial thing, but whether Middle Archaic sheltered sites were primarily short-term logistical production sites or long-term habitation sites is a massive archaeological argument that has to be resolved. And this is also kind of why the big pseudo-archaeological questions like, was there a massive transatlantic copper trade between North America and the Mediterranean during the Archaic period? These questions seem so hilariously pointless and stupid to us because we're looking at these sites with such minute precision. If there was influx and trade with the Mediterranean, we would have found it decades ago and we wouldn't have been able to hide it or miss it. It would be unmistakable. Okay, so the next section of this paper is dealing with the theory that she's using to understand the deeper structures and social implications of these, objective, quantifiable facts. And I want to talk about these because it's really the most interesting component of the paper. And I think it also serves to illustrate why things like the Clovis first hypothesis and the transatlantic copper trade idea, these are not theories. They're hypotheses, but they're not theories. And I've touched a lot of these concepts before in other videos, and I'll put links to the relative videos down in the description. But most of this is falling under the umbrella of theory called human behavioral ecology. The first theoretical principle that she evokes is called optimal forage theory, which is really just based on the idea that humans don't want to spend all of their time looking for food. We have other things to do with our day that don't involve looking for and cooking food to the point that we're able to eat it. So food resources are not evenly distributed across a landscape. And their availability can be really unpredictable at times. Nuts are subject to a process called masting, which means that a grove of hickory trees will drop a certain number of nuts every year. That's like their normal baseline, but every now and again, they're going to produce what's called a bumper crop, which is several times bigger. It's more nuts than are dropped in a given year. And the point of this for the tree is to keep all of the squirrels in the area from being able to eat all the nuts. It's an amount of hickory nuts that drop that the local squirrel population can't keep up with. There's no way for them to eat all of it. So they can go cache a bunch of it, but then that just causes the trees to grow. But all the different hickory groves and different species of trees that do this, because other species of trees also have bumper crops, they're all on different schedules. So this is not you can't predict where the bumper crop is going to happen. And this ties into Lewis Benford's forager and collector model, which is basically just an idea that a group of hunter-gatherers have food gathering strategies that range from a foraging model, which is more opportunistically collecting what they find in their immediate vicinity as they run into it. And on the other end of that spectrum is the collector model, where logistical teams are sent out to collect specific resources, typically in bulk, to be brought back and processed. So we have this spectrum, and like it's going to vary by resource, it's going to vary by time and group and context. These things are variable. But in the Middle Archaic, these kinds of mast trees, like the hickories and the walnuts and so on, they were pretty common. But the environment was generally more warm and dry, and so they're in patches. They're all dispersed. And the availability of these nuts is fairly limited. It's only a resource that you can collect for a couple of weeks every year in the summer and fall. And the deer and the elk know that. So they start going into these areas during these few weeks every year, making it a boom time for people to both hunt and to collect these mast resources. That means that while on a very localized level, tree nuts are an unreliable resource, if you cast a really wide net, they become very reliable. With a bunch of different foraging teams covering a large area to find groves that are producing bumper crops. And these groups can then collect the nuts in bulk and have them processed for long-term storage. But that means that you need a bunch of people working together, like a lot of people working together in these logistical forays. And at this time, most sites, not the rock shelters, but most sites seem to reflect small groups of people moving around the landscape fairly frequently foraging. But in the fall, we see this pattern of much more intensive occupation and activity at these permanent, geologically bounded and defined sites. So Holmesy Messer is observing that the patterns observed in the archaeological record agree with the predictions made by the theoretical frameworks of human behavioral ecology. We see the emergence of a rich but unpredictable resource in the environment, and then people living in that environment devise complex social logistical strategies to make those unpredictable resources reliable. She goes on to discuss the important social implications of these annual bursts of activity at these persistent places, these cave sites. And this is where the concept of the taskscape, which is hard to say, comes into play, which is also another theory within archaeology. That ultimately it's just a way of reframing what a landscape is. Hunter-gatherers are not passively occupying a landscape, reacting to that landscape as it exists, but they're actually actively involved in the construction in a network of relationships between other people, but also plants, animals, water, and the activities that are associated with these places and people. Remember that in indigenous philosophies, plants, animals, places, these are all non-human persons. They're communities of their own that people have relationships with and responsibilities to. So we're not dealing with a bunch of ageless, genderless, calorie-seeking drones moving across the landscape, looking for as much food as they can get their hands on. These are communities, and they're communities that are trying to work together. Now, the last major theoretical issue that she tackles is the internal complexities of those communities. You don't just have people. You have men and women and probably two spirits. You have children and adults and elders. And based on a huge body of ethnographic data, labor tends to be gender associated in hunter-gatherer communities. So think about how, like, as like a modern analogy, elementary education in America tends to be very strongly associated with women. There are plenty of men who are involved in elementary education, but it's mostly associated with women. By the same token, plants are generally the domain of women culturally, especially the processing of those plants into usable end products like oils, or roasting them for storage, things like that, grinding them into flour for baking. To Laura Holmesy Messer, Candy Hollenbach, Steve Carmody, and every other ethnobotanist and hunter-gatherer specialist I've ever read or talked to, the labor of these shelter sites implies a large workforce of women in this time period, once we see this intensive mast processing behavior. And the burials also do reflect this. 75% of the burials at Dust, Stanfield Worley, and Russell Cave, 75% of them are biological female. And this lines up with some observations that Cheryl Clausen has made about women using particular caves and rock shelters as places for giving birth, retreats during menstruation, and for healing, medical practice, which contrasts pretty strongly with George Crothers' research on different caves being used for young men's initiation rites. But the important thing to keep in mind is that they're talking about different caves and rock shelters. It's not that all caves are feminine or all caves are masculine. They're different caves. So that's really all I've got to talk about for today. I really do recommend tracking down the actual paper and giving it a read because A, it's very well written, but also it's one of my favorite pieces of work because of the way that it integrates the data, the methodology, and the theoretical complexity in order to paint a really nuanced picture of how the people's interactions with changing environments and the subsistence strategies that they're devising in order to work within a new world. It puts forward some hypotheses that we're still evaluating and working through. And I think it's a good baseline for understanding these kinds of questions. So I look forward to your comments and your questions as always, and thank you for watching.